Cree Women Liberation Movement. Sex differences in a person. Sex refers to the gender that all human beings belong to, either males or females. Sex difference influences our entire personality, that is, one's gender determines his or her behavior. Adolescence experience in males. Physical experiences. The body becomes hairy, especially on the legs and chest. There is widening of the chest among the boys during this stage. There is deepening of the voice. The body becomes muscular and the body muscles begin to show out. The sweating rate increases at this stage. The size of the penis enlarges at this point. Sexual experiences. The boys begin to experience wet dreams during this stage. There is production of millions of sperm, so they are ready to become fathers at this stage. Emotional experiences. There is development of friendship with girls during this stage. Boys pick interest in holding the girls' waists, bums, and hands. Boys become jealous for the girls when they see the girls being befriended by other boys. Social experiences. Boys always trouble to be noticed by others in the society. They would like to seek public recognition and they will attach themselves to names. They like joining with peers with whom they have some interests. Mental experiences. They develop an independent thinking at this stage. They tend to be critical with everything and develop a high reasoning at this stage. There is desire for self-discovery because they have a mentality that self-discovery is the best teacher. Spiritual experiences. Some boys turn to God at this stage while others totally run away from God. Adolescence experience in females. Cree Women Liberation Movement. They start menstrual cycles which occur monthly. There is widening of the hips to the extent of being visible. The voice becomes soft and piercing. The girl's skin becomes soft and smooth as opposed to the boys that becomes rough. Some girls develop pimples on their forefaces during this stage. They develop breasts which enlarges at a high rate. Social experiences. Girls tend to search for peers of the same interests. They expect to win sympathy and attention from the public. They find interest in challenging superiors, especially their mothers. They are sometimes sensitive on how the public feels about them. Emotional experiences. During this stage, the girls are unpredictable, that is, at times you find them jolly and at times moody. There is development of strong feeling and relationship for the boys, that is why they begin dating adult men and those they can handle. Hysteria is common among girls because they tend to have too much love for their lovers. Mental experiences. Girls tend to develop an independent thinking during this stage. Their reasoning capacity begins to increase at a higher rate compared to boys. They make choices they want to achieve during this stage. How sex education is passed on to the teenagers today. Many youth today learn about issues regarding sex from their peer groups of members of common interests where they tend to share a lot of information about sex. Students today learn a lot from school about sex-related issues as they interact with their teachers, matrons, and wardens. Also, some subjects taught in schools pass on information about sex. For example, subjects like biology under the topic of reproduction and CRE under the topic of sex difference and person. Some parents today have played a vital role of passing on information about sex to their Cree Women Liberation Movement. Different respectable people have passed on sex education to the teenagers. For example, Queen of Buganda Lady Sylvia Nabajirka, under her program of Ekyakit, she has educated the youth about sex-related issues. Many groups have organized drama or plays which have educated the youth about sex-related issues. For example, the group of the Ebenezer Stays various plays at theatre, Labanita, which have passed on educative information. Parents today have also faced a challenge of peer group influence where the teenagers tend to trust their friends more than their parents, so they tend to take on the advice of their friend and ignore the advice of their parents. Sub-theme 11. Sex difference in the person. Women liberation movement/struggle. Aspects in which women are still oppressed today. Women have been denied recognizable positions in some church affairs. For example, in the Catholic Church they have denied the women to take on the position of being priests. The position of priesthood has only been reserved for men. Most women have been denied respect in their own families. They have been denied chance to make decisions in their families. Some women have been forced to get married by their parents because they want to get bride wealth. For example, in some Muslim families, parents have forced their daughters into marriage, and among the Karamojans, women are still forced into Cree Women Liberation Movement. Women are still associated to all forms of misfortunes or bad omen in the family and society. For example, when a couple gets AIDS, the blame is put on the woman. When a couple fails to produce, the blame is put on the woman, yet they are men who are also impotent. Women have been discriminated or denied employment opportunities by many employers because they are regarded to have a weaker sex and prefer giving the jobs and promotions to men. Some women have been denied chance to participate in the politics of their country by their husbands, like some women have been refused to vote people of their choice to contest, especially if they belong to different political party. Some women have been harassed by men, they are raped and have ended up getting sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted pregnancies. Some women have been divorced for minor reasons against their wish, which is looked at as a form of oppression. There are some unfair cultural practices imposed on the women, like female genital mutilation, which inflicts a lot of pain to women, and it has denied women chance to enjoy sex. For example, this practice is still carried out by the Sabinis of eastern Uganda and the Pokots in northeastern Uganda, sect among the Karamojons. There is a lot of woman trafficking, where today some women have been sponsored to go abroad and work, and on reaching there they are forced into acts of sex. Cree Women Liberation Movement to achieve free completion with men in social, economic and political aspect, for example education, employment, etc. To protect women against domestic violence in form of beating them, which may lead to loss of lives and others left injuries. To promote girl-child education, since many parents preferred to educate boys at the expense of girls that they had chance of getting married. To fight against the unfair cultural practices that were imposed onto the women, for example female genital mutilation among the Sabinis of northeastern Uganda. Women wanted to own property, since in traditional society women were denied chance to own property, since all property belonged to men, because they needed a louder and effective voice to influence the issues in their families and take part in decision making. They needed to take start in generating projects for women, especially those in rural areas, than depending on only agriculture. To protect women against sexual abuse, since men considered them sexual objects. Government's contribution towards women liberation struggle. The existing government is known for respecting fundamental human rights of all people regardless of sex. Women today have been allowed to fully participate in politics of their country by Cree Women Liberation Movement. The government has promoted girl-child education by giving the women 1.5 points when joining public universities. For example, when joining Makerere and Kyambogo universities, the girls are given 1.5 points, which is denied to the men. The government has put in place mixed tertiary institutions which have exposed men and women to competitive academics. For example, the government has put in place Makerere, Gulu and Kyambogo universities, which are for both men and women. The government has put in place strict laws that are aimed at protecting women. For example, the on domestic relations, which is aimed at fighting against domestic violence, a law against rape and defilement, which is aimed at fighting against sexual abuse. A special day has been dedicated to the women by the government. For example, every 8th March each year is a day dedicated to women as Women's Day, and it's a public holiday on the Uganda's calendar. The current government has fought against the unfair cultural practice imposed on women. For example, they have carried out anti-female circumcision campaign among the Sabinis of eastern Uganda. The government has kept all profile professions open to all people regardless of sex. For example, the professions of law, medicine, and engineering have been made open in all tertiary institutions. Employment recruitment for workers by the government is given to both men and Cree Women Liberation Movement. Positive impact. Women have promoted the leisure industry. They have greatly contributed to the development of the music industry and the large, because the country has been in position to get revenue. For example, female artists like Sheeb Karangi, Judith Abrai, etc. have greatly contributed to the development of the music industry. Women have started income generating projects due to government's financial support through providing loans to them, which has helped them to live a self-sustainable life. For example, many women have started income generating projects like poultry, piggery, farms, etc. Women have formed women organizations that have sensitized women about their rights, and they have gone ahead to fight for the rights of women. For example, FIDA of Women Lawyers has come up to fight for the rights of women. Women have played a vital role in the security department, where they have worked as police officers, prison wardens, which has helped to bring about law and order. Women have been sensitized women about their health matters through seminars, workshops, and mass media. For example, they have been sensitized about cervical cancer immunization, AIDS. Women have been fought against the unfair cultural practice imposed on them by sensitizing them about the side effect of such practices. For example, the government has carried out anti-circumcision campaign among the Sabinis of eastern Uganda. Women have been allowed to participate in church leadership by allowing them to take up church roles. For example, Pastor Imelda Namuta by the owner of Liberty Worship Center in Ruboga Division, and Pastor Irene Manjuru the ownership of Bethel Covenant Church in Kaiten Kidavu. Women have played a vital role in the affairs of their families by allowing them to take part in the decision-making in their families. Girl-child education has been promoted by the government. This has helped to increase on the number of girls enrolled in public tertiary institution by giving them 1.5 points when joining public universities. For example, when joining Makara, university girls are given 1.5 points. Cree Women Liberation Movement. Women have gained courage to take up high-profile professions like today many women have become lawyers, doctors, and engineers. Women have been allowed to participate in the politics of their country. For example, Honorable Betty Cameo was allowed to contest for a presidential post in 2011. Hon Janet Museveni is the full Minister of Education. Women liberation struggle has also brought about equal participation in trade and economics. Negative impact. It has led to increased cases of divorce in the families because women have been given a lot of freedom and they no longer give respect to their husbands since they can sustain themselves with their children without the support of men. It has resulted into child neglect since mothers go to work every day and come back late in the night. It has led to increased immorality in the society since many women have resorted to marrying on young boys because they have the money to spend. It has led to loss of cultural respect as women fight for equality with men. For example, many women have resorted to putting on trousers which were originally for men because they want to show equality. There are increased cases of domestic violence in families today due to women liberation struggle because educated women and those in a working class have failed. Cree Women Liberation Movement. PUN. Using examples show how women are competing with men today. Education is open to both men and women when joining tertiary institution. For example, Makara University is open to both men and women. Honorable Shea Simango is the Minister for Higher Education and Honorable Rosemary Essenid is the Minister of Lower Education. They are competing in the field of economic development where both men and women are sharing roles. For example, Maggie Kigozi, the former chairperson of Uganda Investment Authority, with Gordon Wavamuna, the owner of Spear Motors, and Wava Waters. They are competing in the field of mass media. For example, TV presenter like Sanyu Robina Emuka, newsreader on Buked, and Krista Pando on NTV. They are competing in the field of urban development. For example, Jennifer Musising, the former executive director of Kampala City Council Authority, and Honorable Elias Lakwego, the mayor of Kampala. Today, women are competing with men in the leisure industry. For example, Fik Famika and Sheba Karangi are competing in the music industry. Both men and women are competing in politics. For example, Hon Betty Kamya and President Yoweri Museveni contested for presidential post in 2011. Hon Rebecca Kadoga, Speaker of Parliament, and Hon Jacob Wolaina, Deputy Speaker of Parliament. Women are competing with men in the field of security, like both work in police and Cree Women Liberation Movement. They have involved in politics. They propose to men today. They are heading churches today. For example, Pastor Imelda Namitebai of Liberty Worship Center. They own property. They have involved themselves in the leisure industry. They have involved themselves in sports, for example, girls and boys football. They pay taxes. They are involved in providing security. They have involved themselves in business world. They make decisions at different levels, especially in families. They're the breadwinners in many families. Ways in which girls are competing with boys. In schools, they both have similar uniform in terms of color. Education is open to both boys and girls. For example, universal primary education and universal secondary education is open to both boys and girls. The curriculum followed in schools is the same for both boys and girls. Schools provide the same meals for both boys and girls. Both girls and boys sit for the same examination in schools. When grading children in schools, the grading is the same for both boys and girls. Cree Women Liberation Movement. They play the same games in schools, for example, volleyball, basketball. Rules and regulations are the same for both boys and girls in schools. Both are given the same punishments in case of indiscipline. Sex difference and the person in African traditional society. Position of a woman in African traditional society. Women in ATS were regarded as inferior and therefore had a disadvantaged position compared to men. Women had fixed roles. It was the work of women to do all the domestic and agricultural work. Women were physically assaulted by their husbands because men claimed the right to discipline their wives. They would sometimes beat them even in the presence of their children. For example, among the Acholis of northern Uganda, men used to discipline their wives in the presence of their children. Parents in ATS reduced their daughters to the level of bought property by asking for very expensive dowry, which forced men to treat their daughters as bought property. For example, among the Karamojons of northeastern Uganda, a man was asked to pay between 4 to 100 herds of cattle as dowry. They used to impose unfair cultural practices onto the women, like female genital mutilation. For example, among the Sabinis of eastern Uganda, they used to carry out Cree Women Liberation movements. Women were denied the chance to initiate divorce. It were only the men who were allowed to divorce their wives. Women were looked at as sources of bad omen or misfortune in the society and family. For example, among the Bakiga of western Uganda, when a man found a woman while going for hunting, he would cancel the mission. Women were looked at as beasts of burden where they did all the donkey work. For example, among the Bakiga of western Uganda, women did all the donkey work, ranging from domestic, agricultural, etc. Women were subjected to food taboos. They were denied chance to enjoy the delicious dishes. For example, among the Baganda of central Uganda, women were prohibited from eating eggs, chicken, grasshoppers, etc. Women's marital rights were abused by allowing men to practice polygamy. This resulted into women being sexually starved since men had many wives. Birth of a baby boy brought more joy than birth of a baby girl to the family, where in some families the birth of a baby boy was even accompanied with a party. Attitude towards women in African traditional society. Positive. Women were looked at as teachers because they provided sex education to their children. Women were regarded as mothers in the society. Cree women liberation movement. In some societies, women were used as spies. For example, among the Baganda and the Kabakas place, women were used as spies. Women acted as a source of status to men. For example, among the Baganda, men got status depending on the number of women they had. In some homes, women were looked at as flowers. Women were considered to be delicate and were treated very careful. For example, among the Banyarwanda and Baganda, women were treated with care. Negative. Women were considered to be inferior in most of the African traditional society. Women were taken as sex objects and men looked at them as people who were there to satisfy their sexual desires. Women were taken as part of the man's property. Women were looked at as sources of bad omen in the society and family. They were looked at as foreigners in their husbands' families. They were looked at as beasts of burden. They were considered to be unclean. They were looked at as keepers of the home. Herein, give the differences that existed between men and women in African traditional society. Ways through which sex education was passed on to the Cree women liberation movement. Through use of initiation ceremonies which initiated young ones to the adulthood stage. For example, among the Baganda, sex education was passed on during the pulling ritual visiting of the bush, where sex secrets were revealed to the girls, and among the Bajishu, during circumcision, sex secrets were revealed to the boys. Through use of punishments which prevented them from having sex before marriage. For example, when a girl got pregnant before marriage, they would ask the elder brother to take her on top of a cliff and push her down, which would be lesson to the young ones. Sex education was passed on to the young ones through use of moral stories and songs that passed on information regarding sex. Through use of private localities like a bush away from home, which was referred to as a bush school, where sex education was passed on, and all the young ones had to attend these lectures, which were mainly conducted by the aunties. Through use of aunties and uncles who prepare young ones for marriage, and they courageously revealed the truth about how children were born, and that it was as the result of the father and mother having a sexual intercourse that children were formed. Through parents like father, mother, uncles, and aunt who guided and counseled the children about the life skill and sex values. Through valuing the virginity of girls, for example, among the Baganda Shigot Cree women liberation movement, virginity until marriage was highly emphasized among girls. Hygiene and beauty tips were taught. For example, among the Bator, special ghee and herbal perfume were applied by the girl in order to look beautiful. Boys and girls were taught how to please their partners sexually. Emphasis on the respect of sexual organs, that is why pet names were given to them. Boys were taught about the wet dreams and girls taught about their monthly periods. Traditional birth control methods were taught to girls, for example, prolonged breast feeding, use of herbs. Young ones were separated from sleeping together to avoid incest. Certain medicines were provided to cater for sexual disorders, body odor, and partial impotence. Roles played by parents in African traditional society. Women/mothers. They produced children and looked after them until when they were mature. They provided informal education to the young ones through moral storytelling. They disciplined their children throughout their stages of life because badly behaved children were always blamed onto the mothers. Women did all the domestic work, including cooking food, looking after the children. Women earned wealth to their families when they were getting married, and Cree women liberation movement. Women had the role of bringing sexual satisfaction to their husbands, and sex was supposed to be only between the husband and wife, unlike today when men sleep with animals. Women were the custodians of culture and traditions. They introduced their children to their own culture and ensured that children learned their culture. Roles played by men. Men and their sons were a source of security in the home. They would defend and protect their families and the community at large from external attacks. Men played a political role as chiefs and clan leaders as they chaired the clan and society meetings. Men provided basic necessity for the family. The father and the sons would go hunting for meat and food for the family. A man disciplined the whole family, that is, all children and their mothers were disciplined and controlled by their husbands. Men made shelters for their families, and this was common in all societies. Men also looked after the livestock. For example, among the Karamajungs and Bahima, it was the responsibility of a man to look after the cattle. Sex difference and the person in church history. Ways through which women were discriminated in church history. Cree women liberation movement. Women were denied chance to carry out general duties in church, for example, the duties of deacons. Women were denied chance to repent on behalf of their family. It were only for men who were invited for this purpose. Women were denied chance to interpret scriptures because they believed that it were only the men who were invited for this purpose. Women were denied chance to pray on behalf of their families. Prayers were led by men. Women were denied chance to join fellowships. They were always encouraged to remain home and do domestic work. Veneration of the saints was done for only men. It was hard for a woman to be referred to as a saint. Women were denied chance to carry out missionary work, as all missionary work was carried out by men. Women were looked at as the source of evil, basing on the story of Adam and Eve, when Eve tempted Adam to eat the forbidden fruit. Women were denied chance to divorce their husbands, whereas men were allowed to divorce their wives. Talking in public was for only men. Women were denied chance to talk in public, because they regarded it as a disgrace for women to make public arguments. Cree women liberation movement. They catered for the disadvantaged children. For example, they catered for the orphans, lame and blind. Some women were trained to offer services to the general public. For example, Hannah Cage worked as a teacher in Encol for the Anglican Church. They called for monogamous marriages among Africans to bring love for the husband, wife and children. They emphasized independent choices as opposed to widow inheritance, which was practiced by the African families. In the Anglican churches, women were ordained as reverends and were therefore important in the ministry of the church. Women were encouraged to take key positions in the church and participate in its activities. The church involved many women in preaching the gospel. For example, the Catholic Church trained many girls as nuns, which helped them to raise their status. Hannah Kejai. QN. How did Hannah Kejai of Uganda contribute to the struggle of equality between men and women? Hannah was a Ugandan woman who was among the first women to realize equality with men. She was a widow to the Toro chief, and she became a Christian in 1898. Cree Women Liberation Movement. She was in charge of the girls in a mission school, and she always cared for them while in school. She taught the girls handcraft skills, most especially girls in the rural areas of Toro and Ankol, which earned them income. She called upon women everywhere to go to school because it would benefit them in future. She called upon women everywhere to serve God and fellow man. Biblical teaching about sex difference. Old Testament teaching. Q9. Explain the biblical ideas that support the equality of men and women. Q and Wo. How does the Old Testament show that men and women are equal? Q entry. Mention areas in the Old Testament that shows that men and women are equal. According to Genesis 1:26-28, God created both man and woman in his image, which indicates that they are equal. God called upon both men and women to serve him. He never discriminated them depending on sex. For example, God called Samuel, who was a judge and a priest, and prophetess Deborah to convey his message to the people. During Noah's time, God punished and blessed both men and women, which reconciles the sex difference between men and women. In Genesis 2:24 states that man would unite with his wife and become one, which Cree Women Liberation Movement. According to the Old Testament, both men and women are given a command to develop the earth and share God's creative power, where they are both commanded to subdue the earth. Genesis 1:26-28. In the Old Testament, both Adam and Eve were punished by God when they disobeyed him by eating the forbidden fruit. He sent both of them out of the Garden of Eden without minding their sex. Genesis 3. According to the Old Testament, the Sabbath day was set aside as a day of rest for both men and women when God commanded both to rest on the day of rest. God answered all people's prayers regardless of sex, which reconciles the sex difference. For example, God answered Hannah's prayers by blessing her with a son, Samuel, and also answered Job's prayers by healing him from a terrible skin disease. In the courts of law, they called for fairness when judging cases regardless of sex. The Old Testament also calls upon for reward for work done regardless of sex, and calls upon all employers to pay wages to their employees after performing for them a task. According to the Old Testament, man and woman were created for companionship purposes. Man and woman need each other's company. God provided food to both men and women during the Israelites' travel in the Wilderness by giving them manna and water after a long time of hunger. Examples of women who served the community. Cree Women Liberation Movement. Anna. She dedicated her own son Samuel for the service of God. Judith. She killed the king Hophran who was oppressing the Israelites. Judah 12:13. Miriam. She was a prophetess. Il. She brought victory when she killed the tyrant commander called Sisera. New Testament teaching on sex difference. Q. Nunn. How does Jesus' teaching emphasize equality between men and women? Hugh Entwell. Give the New Testament teaching about men and women. Q. Entry. How did Jesus bridge the gap between men and women? The New Testament teaches us the judgment day is meant for all mankind, which brings about equality. According to the NT, eternity is promised to all mankind regardless of sex. He promised everlasting life to whoever believes in him. According to NT, all people are urged to love one another, which shows that we are all equal. John 13:34-35. According to NT, peace was brought to all the troubled hearts regardless of sex. For example, Jesus brought peace to a rich young man who was troubled with his riches. Cree Women Liberation Movement. The NT teaches that Jesus' resurrection is a hope to both men and women. John 11:25, where it is stated that whoever believes in Jesus will have to resurrect again. The NT teaches that the universal gospel preached by Jesus is meant for both men and women without discrimination, which brings equality. According to the NT, the miracles performed by Jesus benefited both men and women regardless of sex, which brings equality. For example, Jesus rose Lazarus from death, and he also healed a woman who had spent 12 years in her menstruation period. Mark 5:25-29. The NT teaches us that Jesus had compassion or love for both men and women, and because of his love he, for example, rose a widow's son. John 11:23-24, and he also rose Lazarus from death. Mark 6:34. The NT teaches us that Jesus associated with all people and befriended both men and women, which reconciles the sex difference between men and women. For example, he associated with Martha, Mary, and also associated with his disciples. The NT teaches that Jesus prepared rooms in heaven for both men and women. According to the NT, Jesus promised the Holy Spirit to both men and women to guide them in their day-to-day life, which brings equality. According to the NT, Jesus forgave both men and women, which reconciles the sex difference. For example, Jesus forgave those crucified him and also forgave the adulterous woman who was supposed to be stoned to death. Cree Women Liberation Movement. Women were expected to do domestic work even on Sabbath day, yet men were exempted from doing work on Sabbath. Men were allowed to divorce their wives if they never pleased them, yet women were denied this chance even when their husbands never pleased them. Polygamy was allowed, and men married more than one wife. For example, King Solomon had 700 official wives, and Elkanah had Hannah and Peninnah. Women were taken as men's property. For example, the Decalogue states that it don't admire another man's property inclusive of his wife. Women became subordinate of the man, and she had to have great desires for them. Man after the fall of man. Some institutions like priesthood was specifically for men since women were considered unholy. New Testament. During Jesus' time, women were never considered in the national census. In the New Testament, men were allowed to divorce unfaithful women, yet nothing was done to the unfaithful men. Matthew 5:36. Women were considered to be a weaker sex according to 1 Peter 3:4. Husbands are considered to be superior over their wives, and the women are supposed to be submissive to their husbands. Role played by the church in uplifting the status of Cree Women Liberation Movement. Centenary Bank that belongs to the Catholic Church has employed women as managers, cashiers, etc. The church has helped women in formation of women dynamic groups which have supported women economically and socially. For example, the church has supported the Women to Form Mothers Union in both the Protestant and Catholic churches. The church has helped in establishing and funding health centers, which has helped to improve on the health status of women. For example, St. Francis in Zambia is supported by the Catholic Church, and Mengo Hospital is supported by the Anglican Church. The church has supported women to take on church leadership roles, which has helped them to earn income and also to live a self-sustainable life. For example, Pastor Imelda Namuta, by the owner of Liberty Worship Center, have earned a living from their churches. The church has supported women to develop their talents, which has earned them income. For example, Honorable Judith Barbara was supported by the Pentecostal Church to develop her talent of music, which has earned her income. The church has offered guidance and counseling to people already married and those intending to get married, which has helped to build confidence in them. For example, at Rubaga Cathedral they have the Tuesday class where they offer guidance and counseling to those married and those intending to get married. Cree Women Liberation Movement.